Anybody have tickets to the game?
Which game?
Anybody have a couple tickets to the game? We can see the new room. Especially super. I am going on, next time. No boss, no.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying for this last session. My name is Andy Adkins. I'm at the University of Florida College of Law. I have two distinguished panelists here. Steve Lawrence, who is Steve Burnett, who's with Seattle University School of Law, George Clooney, or George Comeau from Suffolk Law School. We're going to sort of talk a little bit today, and then we're going to turn this over to you guys so we can leave. If I know a lot of people have probably got flights sooner than mine today, so feel free if you have to just head on. Anyway, we're talking about ADA standards for technology in law schools. Before we get too far ahead, let me kind of give a moment to our two guys here and let them talk a little bit about themselves. George, who are you and why are you here?
I'm from Suffolk University Law School in Boston, and for some of you who've been to our law school, you know that we rolled out technology in just about every room in a pretty holistic way. And we did that when we opened the brand new building, a $75 million building in 1999. And now we're in the process of bringing that technology to the next level. Unfortunately, most of our faculty believe that all law schools have that level of technology, and they make us jump through hoops when things don't work. Because if it can work in Seattle or Florida or wherever, it should be able to work for them. So we're very interested in talking about standards, and also I think we're interested in understanding or helping the ABA and the accreditors understand how important that is to the learning process. And so it's, I'm glad for the invitation to be able to come and talk about this, but also more importantly, to be able to listen and figure out some way to help influence what will be the new standards.
And I'm the Associate Dean for Information Services at Seattle University Law School. And I'm here because I put an email on a listserv that pissed everybody off. So it's not the only reason I'm here. I gave a talk about the future of the law libraries program in Jacksonville a couple months ago. I had the talk completely finished, and the day before my talk was to happen, the proposed standards came out from the ABA, so I had to completely ditch it and start over again. And there were some comments made during that session. It was primarily aimed at libraries, but there were also lots of talk about technology and how that's going to affect libraries. And some of the comments that were made there, I kind of felt were, well, let's see.
Shooting from the hip.
Inappropriate or unfair or bad characterizations, and that's kind of why I sort of tongue-in-cheek put an email out about librarians reporting to technology staff as opposed to the notion other way around. And I think that one thing I'm looking at is that our standards, the way that we ought to manage technology in law schools. Is it the right approach to have standards for technology? Is there a protectionism piece of that? You know, I feel that the law libraries, over the course of a number of years, have created a series of standards that really do offer protection for library staff, protection for library budgets, and not just protections, but opportunities that make them a recognized integral part of the law school. And I don't think that's there for technology. And the question is the standard approach the right approach to take, or is there another approach?
I'm very pleased to be speaking here today with both Steve and George. I've known them for a while. They're my mentors in this industry. They've plowed the way a lot for a lot of things we're doing. As I mentioned before, I'm at the University of Florida College of Law. I wear several hats like probably everybody else in this room does. I'm a consultant. I'm the director of Legal Technology Institute. I'm also the associate director of technology services, so all of the technology falls into my realm. We are also, for the last year, totally renovating our law school, ripping out all the old classrooms, installing new ones. We're going from 11 and some of the old-style two-story Alpine rooms into more rooms that are more appropriate to teach in, with technology in every classroom. And as we speak, we're also installing a brand new phone system, so including changing every phone number on the planet. So I'm looking at taking 9 months off when I get back, so I don't have to face unhappy people with changing their phone numbers. But you know, technology is constantly changing, and that's kind of what drew this together. When the technology standard, the proposed technology standards came out, I think Elmer posted a message on the Technoids listserv and saying, you know, here they are, care to comment. There was probably 70 or 80 comments for that. And one of my comments was, well, I think this is great. This is a great discussion. I said, you know, why don't we as a group, CALI and Technoids, put together what we think the standards ought to be? And John Myers spoke up and said, that's great, Andy, why don't you do a session at CALI? So I called on Steve and George and asked them if they'd be interested in joining me, and that's kind of how all this came about. So we just kind of want to give a little bit of overview of how technology got to where it is now in law schools. If you haven't seen this before, this is a jet breaking the sound barrier at about 100 feet above water. Now, take your eyes away from the jet and just figure out how this cameraman can follow a jet. He's traveling at 750 miles an hour and keep it centered in the screen. Anyway, I just kind of show this because technology is going by so fast. It's just blowing by. And what we develop now and talk about standards is going to continuously be changing. So that's one of the things we have to keep in mind. I'm sure many of you are facing issues in the legal profession, not only with students but with faculty, that technology is so far ahead that the laws can't keep up. And there's a lot of issues that technology is bringing to the forefront that the lawyers are now trying to create legislation so that they can keep up with technology. Traditionally, as we know, most of technology started with the law librarians, and a lot of it was because of legal research. That's pretty much where it started, and the legal profession as it is doesn't move as quickly as other businesses or other industries. So there's been very little movement other than keeping everything within the library or under the library umbrella. And we're starting to see a lot of schools that are sort of developing their own, and there's a lot of issues that we have to deal with. What this slide basically represents is sort of top down. This is where we started with the library, and now we're starting to get into things like distance education, which really doesn't have anything to do with the library. And so we want to kind of discuss, some of the major issues that we're facing. I think everybody here has heard this mantra throughout this particular conference. We're constantly demanding more of our users. Our users are constantly demanding more technology that requires resources, finances. I mean, it just affects the entire spectrum of what we do for the law schools. Just have to show that when we're talking about standards, we're talking about all different levels of communications. Let me just kind of give you an idea of what the standards are. This was new to me. As you know, there's ABA approval processes for law schools, and they typically follow these 8 chapters. These are, quote, the standards for ABA approved law schools. Chapter 7 is facilities, which is where the technology in the law library falls into. Up until recently, these are proposed. These are not actual. These are what's proposed. They had just 3 chapters, 701, 702, and 703. And 704 is what's proposed. Guess what? This is it. You read it, a law school shall have the technological capabilities that are adequate for both its current program of legal education and for growth anticipated in the immediate future. That says a lot. It's very, very gray. And I think what we wanted to do today is basically show you this is what is being proposed, and then start getting some feedback about how we might be able to create and write and provide guidelines to the ABA for these standards in the technology and law schools. I just thought it was very cool that somebody wrote this in the legal profession, and I've never seen anything written in the legal profession that is so short. You can put all of this on one page. I'm going to do now.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Was anybody here a part of the drafting of that standard? Good. Do people know who's on the standards review committee that drafted these standards?
I can't say for sure that I do know, but I do know that some of the liaisons work as well. Let me see who's here now, first of all. At last year's meeting in Seattle, there was a discussion on this very topic, and that discussion was hosted by Glenn Peter Allers and Trish Cervenko. And they were, at least in the liaison capacity, to go back to the law library part of the drafting process.
Right, and there are also proposed law library standards too, which changes that came out at the same time that are actually, I think, some pretty good changes, pretty interesting changes. But the reason I asked that question is it seems to me that if the ABA is going to propose standards dealing with technology, that somebody from the Standards Review Committee ought to be at this conference asking the technology people what should they be. Where's Dan Fralin, for instance, who's the director of the law, associate dean for information services, I guess Dan is called, and he is on the Standards Review Committee. And it just puzzles me that there isn't that sort of an ask being made of the people whose lives are affected by this, by the standards of people. So,
But do you think it's conscious?
I was going to say something, I just decided not to do it.
Be careful.
No, I don't think so. I think it's just it just is. I don't think it's consciously avoiding the technology. No, I don't think so at all.
Well, one of the other things.
And Dan's a great guy. I'm not dissing Dan at all. I think he's a wonderful guy and very open-minded and interested in this stuff, and would be interested in hearing from us. So please don't interpret what I'm saying as disrespecting Dan. You know, Sally. Yeah.
I just look. I can read off the names. The people around the table.
Yeah.
Professor Daniel Bernstein at Portland State University. President Manuel Brooks-Dean at Claremont. Honorable Carol Kapsner, Bismarck, North Dakota. Professor John Miller, University of Idaho. Professor Richard Newman, Hampton, New York. Barry Sullivan, Esquire, General Block, Chicago. David Williams, Nashville, Tennessee. Dean Donald Widener, Tallahassee, not sure. Professor Rita Rusch, the librarian at Utah. Richard Morgan, Las Vegas. Dean Richard Morgan, Las Vegas. Dean David Lebron, Columbia. Judge Martin Gray, Gallery, Nashville, and Diane Ross, Buffalo, New York.
A lot of technology people in that group, I think.
So that's,
Well, and they're not all educators.
No.
They intentionally
Right.
include people from the legal community.
Sure.
Oh, and I forgot to mention the chair of the outcome.
the chair is Professor Martin Burke at Montana and Associate Dean Dina Stein at AU.
That's for all standards, right? Standards
Right,
include
yeah.
things that don't think they're only supposed to look at technology. It's all AD,
It's all-
accreditation standards.
But also keep in mind, I mean, one of the things we were talking about at dinner last night was that the standards for law libraries, I think, was developed in the
Yeah, you mentioned Glenn Peter Allers, who's written a really excellent book about the development of law libraries. I can't remember who was on that slideshow that presented, but the first standard for law libraries in the ABA was a law school should have a library. So contextualizing this, if this is the first attempt to do something with technology, then there's lots of room for improvement and growth and interaction.
Baby steps.
Baby steps. Yeah, I mean, it always is. I'm an impatient person, so for me, I'd like to see things done the way they ought to be done ultimately. But the fact that
It could take 40 years.
it could take 40 years, which is what was taken for the law library standard. That's valid.
The other thing, I'm just looking at the ABA site, there is a technology committee, which theoretically I would think would be
Section of Legal Education Technology Committee. Yes,
the
I'm on that.
ones that would be sending the information to the standards review.
I'm actually on that committee, and I think Nick is on that committee. And that committee, since there was a Rutgers conference on pedagogy to practice in the fall, and that committee hasn't met anymore, and we had absolutely nothing to do with these standards.
Because
Trust me.
for the library, there's a library committee on the section.
Yep.
That committee did work with the library community and send information
Right.
to the standards review.
No, John Mayer, Ron Stout, Nick Terry, Tom Gallagher is the dean of Tennessee. There are several people on there that have a lot of technological background, and there was no consultation of us at all.
Well, would that be also the responsibility of the committee?
Well, potentially, yeah. Yeah, we're a little puzzled as to why the committee no longer meets.
Well, yeah.
That says something.
there's a technology committee at the legal education level.
Yeah, sexual legal education technology.
Could you have invited someone from ABA?
I'm sorry?
Could you have invited someone from ABA?
You're putting it back on me, basically, right?
You're not going to far away.
Yeah, they are far away.
Yeah,
no,
today's
that's true.
Saturday.
Yeah, John Siebert. Sure, that's probably, maybe we were remiss of not doing that.
Of course, he's leading, so
Yeah.
I think it is kind of a bad signing in relation to the ADA that when I ran into somebody from the ADA tag, I had said they can look for the ADA. I was wondering if I'm trying to find this sort of thing, right? He didn't know what Chicago Cam was.
Okay. Well, the CAB truck drivers in this town don't either.
Cabby couldn't find his place.
George had trouble getting here this morning.
Do you want me to go forward with it? These proposed standards are really taking the technology piece out of the facilities part of the ABA standards for approval of law school. There are several other places within the standards that can potentially impact technology. And I think one of the things that I did is I went through every place in the standards that I think have potential implications for technology and are places that could be built upon. So this is what these are about, and this is I'm sort of looking at this off the side to see what we have here. Yeah, but even in the preamble, it talks about the skills necessary to participate effectively in the legal profession. And I don't see how anybody can participate in the legal profession without some ability to use technology, either a word processor or a time and billing system or something. So I think that has some strong implications in terms of what law schools should be doing to educate our students. This is a similar thing. It's in Standard 301 in the objectives. The law school should maintain an educational program that does pretty much the same thing. And effective and responsible participation to me means the ability to interact with technology. What this Standard 301, the objectives, has to do with is the school should show that all students have reasonable, comparable opportunities. If you have a day and evening program, there may be technological implications there to be able to be certain that your part-time students can take part in the programs at the regular school. And then in this curriculum, this is there's a whole section on this, but the other professional skills generally regarded as necessary and effective. Again, this is all part of kind of skills training that I think has technological implications.
What Steve's pointing out is if you go through all of the standards and you look at, there's a lot of implications of what our technology is going to affect various parts of the standards, not just in chapter 7.
So this is about grades, essentially, monitoring progress. Does this mean that we have, or could it be interpreted to say that we need administrative systems to manage how we monitor students, which is a technological result that go beyond that. And then the distance education standards are something that were put in, how many years ago was that when we were involved in this, at the Cornell distance education thing, when George and others in the room that I see were here were talking about. But this is, I think, the place that has the most sort of mention of technology and technology staff and resources and budget of all of the standards.
Well, and I think before we move on this, I think that there's a reason for that. And I remember quite clearly at Cornell, that, we spent a week on this, and most of the conversation was focused on the standards. And for many years surrounding this issue at our law school, and I know many law schools, did not want to participate in going against what they thought the rule was or what it meant or how it would be interpreted. And I think that one of the things that did was it slowed down a lot of innovation that could be happening in this particular area. Now that things have changed, I just came from a technology show in Las Vegas this past week, and the vendors who sell the equipment see law school on the tag, and just about every one of them had said, the standards have changed, you can now buy this equipment. As if you couldn't buy it before. And I just, I think that we shouldn't downplay the importance of these standards and our impact and our ability to make these standards into something that's very meaningful to enhance education. And so that's really the purpose of what we wanted to start here today. It's very much like that Cornell experiment. So,
one of the things I'm trying to take as the libraries kind of moved through this earlier on.
Yeah.
When you talk about academic, there was one thing, discussion of should have a library automated system and all of this kind of stuff. A lot of that started earlier was coming from the questionnaires.
Right.
What the questions we were asking on the questionnaire. So I don't know if it's a chicken or an egg, but the technology questionnaire is certainly not very.
No, and in fact, if these standards are approved, the questionnaire is going to have to change both the ALS part and the ABA part. And further in here, I'll show that the ALS actually has a requirement for a technology plan in law schools. How many people here have a technology plan? You're all in violation of the others of you are in violation of the ALS standards, because they do require a plan.
But can't we do something for this group to begin thinking of to try to offer to the whoever for the questionnaire? Is what questions do we want to, I mean, that's what the library group does.
Right.
What do we want to know?
That's the goal. I mean, today we wanted to have this sort of back
Yeah, but I
and
think,
forth to
I think
begin.
asking what questions we want on the questionnaire is more concrete.
And only recently, that questionnaire has been evolving too, because just in the last couple of years, they've actually added some questions in the technology piece of it that makes some sense. Whereas before, now they're asking about staffing, they're asking about wireless versus wired, there are other things in there. The default questionnaire piece of it. Also, the site visit report is something that needs to change as well. Ken?
Questions and or one question and some comments. What is the mechanics of the process from this point forward as to the status and so forth of the proposed rules? In other words, how do they take comments? What point do they go beyond comments and start drafting and for action by the ABA?
At the meeting in August. So it's a short, very
Time
short
is running.
Time's a waste. Exactly right. The commentary period is getting close to being. That's again, you make a good point. It's probably we should have invited John Sieber here to listen to what people have to say about this. But if we're going to do something as a group, we need to have it done and forwarded to the ABA, by early July.
And the comment is, what's the group? Because there are library directors and there's a library committee, and the librarians, either through, for example, the academic section of AALL or other organizations, the librarians' special interest section of AALS, have a corporate body politic to address these things. We don't.
Right.
If we're putting on our technologist hats.
Right. It's true. That's true. And in fact, status issues in law schools to me are a big issue, and have been one of the big fights in terms of standards. Not just, librarians have done a great job of getting at least the director to have a status in the law school. The legal writers have done a great job of changing their status in law schools. The clinicians have done a great job. All status versus the real people with status, which is the faculty.
Right.
The question now becomes: is there a chance for the technology people in law schools, and should there be a recognition of technology people in law schools having a status that gives you the same sorts of opportunities and protections that the rest of the people, the professional staff in law schools have?
Ken, you were talking a year or so ago.
2 years ago.
About creating a section.
2 years ago, yeah.
And where is that, Ken?
Haven't taken it up with the executive vice president of AALS yet.
I was just going to say that, it really worries me that, Steve, the technology committee and the ABA, that is a formal place where this should be bubbling. You guys aren't meeting.
Right.
That worries me. There needs to be, we need to get to the ABA to say this is important.
Right, and I think that the chairman of the committee felt that the work of the committee was done at the end of the Rutgers conference, and I think that those of us that are members of that committee, and I know there are at least 4 of us in this room right now, I think disagree with that. Nick and John, you can. John and I were speaking on the trolley over this morning. What happened to our committee?
Perhaps you could
we
persuade them.
we could take it over.
Well, perhaps you could persuade them to withdraw the proposal for the time being.
Well, can't this proposal, even if it goes in as
That's
is,
true. That's true.
it can be
That's right.
modified?
You're right. There's everyone withdraw, but perhaps you could.
I don't view this proposal as a bad thing. I think it's a good first step.
It's
You're
actually
right.
a good report.
Could you propose them? Could you rather? The suggestion that needs to be made is great, but let's not forget about it once this is done.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, maybe the thing to do is to find out what is the political and the process to get this thing revised, and how often. When's the next deadline for us?
Michael?
I don't think everybody here is thinking about exactly what the function of these standards is anyway. The first function is to keep people out.
Right.
And you may pump up standards, but they're going to be subject to an antitrust suit. when they keep somebody out, if they ever would, saying your technology isn't up to snuff. I don't think they're ever going to keep anybody out again saying your library isn't up to snuff. You'll see it with Charleston when they come up. The other thing is to give the friendly ABA site evaluators a place to point to when they tell the university president, you got to give the law school a lot more money. As far as I know, those are the two things these standards are about. And they can do that. They can say, they can look at that vague standard, and the evaluation team can say to the university president at their expert interview, oh, your library or your school isn't really meeting the standards, and you've got to put more money into technology, which they'll do if you tell them that's what you want them to do. I mean, that's my understanding how this thing works.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I opened by saying that I'm not sure that ABA standards are where we should be thinking about improving a lot of technology folks in law schools. Because I think the other thing that they do is allow deans to say, or provosts or whatever, say, we've met the minimum standards, that's enough, we don't want to spend any more money here.
Of course, that's, when you got a vague minimum standard in the ABA, you can't do that.
Right.
But I think the suggestion that was made that the way to go at it is in the questionnaire is to start having data about here's what the better schools have. And then the way they used to do it with the salaries before the consent decree was to come in and say, you're not up to the average.
Right.
Everybody has to be above average.
Thank you, Garrett.
That was how
moving
law
on,
school faculty salaries worked. Every 7 years, if you were below average, they would threaten the school. It was great.
Does that apply to technology?
My
It
understanding,
could.
we're up for review as well, so I just attended a ABA session on writing self-studies.
Yeah.
And my understanding was that the standards are intentionally broad and vague and subjectively interpreted by the site team on purpose, so that they can have those conversations with the dean, and they're not locked in by the language. The language is supposed to free them up to help the law school go in the direction it needs to be going, to grow, and to improve the way the dean wants it to, and maybe back them up, because the language is general and non-specific.
So do you see this as helping
There's
that process?
there's an intentionality to it.
You know, there's another piece of this that is interesting to me that law libraries have done, that made them, the standard allows or requires them to have a level of autonomy. And that's an interesting question in a technology world, you know, because, I don't know, there are all different flavors of how law schools handle technology. Either the university provides all the support, or the law school has its own staff, or the university provides central services like, you know, email and ISP and network stuff, and the law school does everything else. And so how do you know, where does that fall? And if you're going to do a pattern of evolving like the law library standards, you know, is that something to look at as a model, or is that something to reject and say, no, we need to do, you know, there's technology is different, but technology still needs to be a vibrant, and this is one of the things that I really dislike in the library standards, is an active and responsive force in the law school, is what it says in the library. But I don't want to be responsive, I want to be proactive, you know, and that's a very different kind of a thing, and I worry about setting minimum standards, and this is, you know, Sally and I have gone back and forth about my email a lot in terms of, you know, my view of this. And I worry that law librarians who are responsible for technology view it as a place to manage and not as an opportunity. And I think there are lots of them that do that. And that was the result of this conversation that occurred at the Future Law Libraries program, is that, okay, yeah, there are struggles managing people that you don't understand where they're coming from all the time in all different aspects of the world, but how can we use the tools that we have now to really enhance the pedagogical mission and the research mission of law schools in ways that people haven't done before? That's, to me, the opportunity.
Well, that's something that could be written in the standard, just about the way you said it. The other thing that should be written in is in the outcomes. 5 years ago, not all of our students would end up in a law firm that was high-tech and used very little paper. Now, chances are 90% of them will.
Or hang their own shingle and practice that.
Yeah, and a lot of them are.
think
And
one-
that's very different, but we need to be looking after the outcomes of our students rather than producing underqualified job candidates.
One of the things we wanted to also also kind of take a quick poll here, is where does IT fit in your law school? And, you know, traditionally, it's under the law library. Some people have they're their own department under the associate dean. As Steve mentioned, sometimes there's a mix between having your IT at the law school, but also sharing IT responsibility with the main campus. Let's ask the first question here. How many of you with your IT department falls directly under the law library? How many of you are your own department under the associate dean? Does anyone here not have your own IT department? In other words, it's all provided by the university. Okay. And then I guess the rest of you kind of have a sharing between the two. A lot of the background infrastructure is on main campus, but yet you handle desktop support, applications, and servers within your own law school. Yes?
This is a question that ought to be formulated with a number of choices to go in an annual questionnaire. I mean, it'd be better to have 180, bits of data on this one.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the other things that we were talking about as we're going through, progressing through the standards discussion, is it's going to take a body of people to kind of develop some questions and stuff. The three of us are going to be on, I mean, there's not a committee, but we're making one, an ad hoc committee of some sort. The three of us are going to be working on this, trying to get something together and try to figure out what it is, the procedures that you have to follow in order to make this thing sound like it's, there's some meat there. But I'd like to sign up a few more volunteers if anybody is interested in helping us with this. Raise a hand. 2, 3, okay. All right. Well, let me make sure before we leave today, make sure I get your contact information.
Just keep going on that a little bit. That's the library portion. And that's for just having that's
Yeah.
for enough.
The other question to ask is one standard good for all law schools? And I find trouble with that sometimes because I know people have different levels of technology at their law school and different uses of that technology. So I'm wondering how we might be able to kind of either write this where it's good for all law schools or whether we divvy it up into various components or various segments of law schools and where that may reside.
Well, the variation among law schools certainly argues in favor of the broad statement that you see up there.
Right.
And then the questionnaire, as Michael says, that might be a place to go with. It's not just the questionnaire, though. It's also the site visit report, which is also a critical piece of it.
And do we have a model questionnaire that we could?
Well, there's the questionnaire. When you've got the questionnaire, and
Yeah.
the questionnaire, the current questionnaire is in software is downloadable from the ABA site. I'm looking at it right now.
I think one thing we ought to think about is additional questions that ought to be put into that questionnaire.
And the challenges of the questions are objective and qualitative, and whereas the site visit is subjective and qualitative, and very differently approached.
Right. But still, it has a big impact on people who are going through the 7-year review process, or people who are going through provisional approval. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think looking at how the library questionnaire has evolved over the years, gotten sort of more and more away from one fits all, looking at quantitative numbers and titles and volumes, and sort of maybe what you'd ask specifically right now, but you can sort of use that as a model. But you can't, it's apples and oranges. And it's the goal that they're really trying to get to as far as how school operates, whether access is that, and asking how many workstations there are isn't necessarily a relevant question.
How many simultaneous access points per wireless?
Yeah, exactly.
What is that?
Yeah.
10,000.
Trying to get more objective to what the language or language is. Going back to the standard one for the education.
The other thing we want to try to avoid is somebody not filling out a questionnaire because they just filled out something similar to somebody else, the national jurist, the ABA, or somebody else just a few weeks ago, and this is something totally different.
I think we're actually speaking about the process is that every fall all law schools fill out an ABA questionnaire for, just for statistical purpose.
If you get on that one, they will fill it out.
Well, the other question is who fills it out? Sometimes,
Well,
the
usually
person that fills it out.
decides who fills out what portion.
Right.
But whoever's willing to fill it out is likely to be the one to fill it out.
The dean has, signed it, obviously.
Good point.
So would the audio visuals be part of this standard?
I would think that we'd have to touch every piece of technology. And a lot of it, again, is what do you use? There's some law schools who don't use audio visuals.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, though, too. Won't technology just grow on its own? Does it need this kind of promulgation? Can you talk a little bit about
Yes,
that? Yeah, okay.
yes, to
Yeah.
the second.
Yes, it needs this, otherwise it won't.
It either won't, or it will be haphazard, uneven, and extremely personality driven.
And so it'll take on the character of the individual school that cares or
Yeah,
doesn't.
exactly.
No. So-
One thing I think with the librarians working through the standards, the questionnaire over the years, both questionnaires, is we had to do a lot of talking in the committees and then as a wider group about what we're thinking about, what we want to know, where we want to go. So it allows that, even though the questionnaire can drive you nuts, and some of the questions there are really stupid, but they kind of move out, but it
They're getting
allows
better.
a place to have a discussion.
Right,
That we don't, there's no technology place to have those
exactly.
discussions.
We're still begging the question.
Right. Well, I think the other thing that's been brought up here is should this the legal education section technology committee try to play a role in this?
And that's where the library role is.
Yeah.
So I would see the parallel as a technology.
Yes, John.
If those of us on the committee were to talk about if this session and the question arose, we send a copy to the chair of the committee, a copy to the animal and to the receiver, I think that might generate some action.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach too. We can certainly add any commentary that anybody would like to add. Yeah,
Me driving in a slightly different direction.
I'd love to be driven in a different direction.
First, I think, an observation that be careful what you wish for, because having detailed standards is not always necessarily what you
Agreed.
When I go out and I do a site evaluation, site visit is a fact-finding process, not a judgmental one. I just swear to that. The key piece today is the self-study. And it's matching up the sense, the ambition of the faculty and the leadership with the resources they have. And so that's kind of where the technology piece fits in today. The other pieces you're talking about, so far you, particularly the first 15 minutes or so, you were talking about process, which is the extent to which tech focus on IT professionals. And you're also talking about status. Be careful with collisions there. The piece that I wanted to talk about was what we mean by standards. The ABA standards are minimum standards. And that's the discussion we've been having here. I think there's another meaning to standards, technological standards, that are going to be increasing. And that is for law schools to move to standardized formats for certain types of documents, for certain types of technology linkages. I mean, how interesting would it be if there was a standard that law schools brought into for what kind of webcasting technology they could use, or what kind of distance ed technologies they were going to use. So it would be far easier to plug us to join our schools together in digital library purposes or all sorts of things like that. So I'd like to see it broaden out a little bit beyond somewhat mundane idea of the minimum standard.
Well, and keep in mind, I think that the manufacturers at the other end are keenly aware of those issues as well. So they want the stuff to talk, for you to be able to talk to Ichtestown, Tamberg, across those lines. So I think that in some cases, some of that will take care of itself. But in many other cases, defining what those commonalities are going to be, it's going to be really difficult, because it's a hard choice to make, and it always has to be assessed. It's continually upgrading as the technology changes, so that you're not just always sitting on the same platform only because the rest of the law schools are on it. So that's something that would have to be like a garden, continually tended.
Yes, John.
Another approach would be a best practices approach, maybe undertaken through the auspices of an AALS section on technology, where you would have committees on certain areas of technology, and they could articulate aspirational standards, and that could be creative.
Yeah, to me, I look at this, the law library approach and the lobbying that the law library community has done to this as not a model, but as an example of a way to approach it, and say that, you know, there are things that I think that all law schools, there are things that they need to do, but there are also things that can really improve the pedagogical mission of a law school, that if people are on board with, and technology people have a voice in the creation of them, you can change the way legal education occurs in the United States, and I think that's something I certainly want to do. I don't know about anybody else, but that's my agenda.
One approach you may want to consider as well is having your final outcomes, in the standard, along with some examples in the interpretation of ways that you could meet that. Not that you have to use these ways, but for example, I went to a session this morning on using video. It was wonderful. It's an excellent tool for increasing confidence in hearing, and that would be one tool that would be an option to use for particular meeting, particular standard.
Well, I think it was Ken that said we're all over the lot in terms of our capabilities. You know, some of us are high-level digital video with media servers and other things, and others have analog to VHS tape, and that's it. You know, and so where do you fall in that?
Going in a different direction, though, I think in the sense that ratings entities like U.S. News are going to begin to look at the technology environment of law schools as some component of their rating.
I haven't heard anything about that. There is a National Jurist does something, and I think there's Wired, the most wired law school.
Yeah,
I have no sense
Yeah.
that U.S. News is going to be looking at that kind of non-academic, non-reputational scoring.
But I can tell you that a lot of law students make decisions based on websites.
No, I was just going to say with that question of U.S. News, I think it depends upon what's put in the questionnaire. They're pulling off the questionnaire. And
It's true.
the questionnaire comes up with something that's easy to rate and pull.
And the only thing that they could even have a chance at would be budgetary. I mean, outlet count and wiring, that's not a valid gauge. Let me put this question, going back to what Andy alluded to, something I mentioned to him a while ago and have mentioned to a couple of other people. It takes 50 people who are members of the AALS, or 50 members of 50 faculty members, whatever you want to call it, who are members of AALS schools, to petition for a provisional section membership. And if you meet regularly at meetings over the course of 3 years and put on the required number of programs, then you get permanent AALS section status. How many people in this room would join on a committee that would sign such a petition and would actively participate in preparing those programs at the annual meeting so that the section proposal could go forward? Or know of someone at their school who would do so? Okay, so it looks like we have 20% of what we need in here.
I think that's actually a good idea too, because that also gets back to the status notion of technologists. Because if you're presenting at an ALS meeting, that goes a long way in terms of the rest of the faculty recognizing that this is part of of the academic program.
Are you talking 50 people or 50 schools?
50 individuals
So we can
who
pull,
are of,
Existing section on it.
so we can pull.
no, that's computer law though. I mean, at least the purpose, the aim, the stated aim of that section is primarily attorneys who practice in the area of computer and technology related law. This would be a section on law school technology. But what I would ask then is everybody who raised your hand, send me an email and I will be very happy to coordinate such an effort. And my email address is ken, K-E-N, @law.duke.edu. And once you do that, we'll have a mailing list very, very quickly.
This is just an observation, but a lot of how IT is viewed, it appears is how historically IT has been viewed in the legal profession. Would it help the boards if they were to look at how medical schools and how business schools, I don't know if there's certification boards handle IT differently, but my guess is that perhaps they do, because those professions do tend to view technology as more of a competitive edge that can be used. Versus the legal community, which only kind of use
Yeah, I think that part of the reason that the council is made up of people who are not all lawyers is to try to get to that point, but I'm not sure that it does. I think it's a very good idea of benchmarking against other professions that have major financial interest in this.
just help move them along. They could look at how there's peers in other industries.
Always a good idea.
Well, there's always this chasm between lawyers and doctors. So I don't know. Hopefully it would help.
Well, the business schools came to the realization long before the law schools did as to the integral role of technology in education.
Well, so did engineering. And I got my master's degree using video technology back in the 80s. Yes, sir.
I just wonder, is there anybody here who just completely disagrees with the notion of having any standards for technology, the ABA standards? Everybody thinks it's a good idea. It's just a question of what it ultimately looks like.
I think the door is open. Yeah. And like you said, we need to take small baby steps to get to that. And I don't think this is a roundup or cowboy. What we're trying to do is just help establish and help move technology a little bit further along in law schools. Yes.
But those standards include both what a school should have to operate its own infrastructure, plus what students should be picking up before they leave.
Well, that's...
There's some real disparate ideas on this, and part of this, I don't want to be involved in, from this premises or something like that, because I don't know anything about that. But I'm a librarian, and I work with our IT people quite a bit, but I teach an internet class, for example. I do want to see students know a whole lot more about how to use things like the internet when you go out there.
Well, I think that the changes that have been recently made in the skills standards part of the ABA standards are really kind of aimed in that direction. And they're aimed at lots of different skills, but I think one of them that's particularly important is the use of technology in legal practice. And I think that would be something that you could do minimum levels of competency. I think if you look back at 301 and the preamble and so forth in terms of being whatever the words, a participant in the profession. I think you could build a case for that. You need to know how to use a word processing system. You need to be able to know how to use email. I mean, they're very simple things in a lot of respects, but a lot of students go out the door without ever having any sort of a legal system grafting on top of what they come to law school with in terms of internet skills or word processing skills or other things. Or electronic filing skills. I mean, you look at the federal court system, the way the administrative office and where it's going with that,
Our district court is in that announcement last year.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, if this encompasses both of those, because IT people have all kinds of different backgrounds. And I think that there's room for, certainly in what does the network look like? I don't need to be involved in that.
Right.
But I
of the clinical people, whoever.
Right.
I think one of the things that we talked about before is, there on the technoids discussion, there was a big discussion about the need to have, educational either a JD or an MS in information management or something like that. And I think we wanted to sort of avoid that discussion because you could spend the rest of the entire time talking about educational standards. However, I think it's critically important. The status piece of this is critically important and something that needs to be addressed by whoever comes together on this. Because if you don't have a certain level of, we're an academia, and if you don't have a certain level of, the tickets punched, then it's just not going to happen. You're not going to be viewed as a professional people.
Is there any American law school or currently offered programs in the law schools mandate that students bring a certain standard computer equipment?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of law schools that have a mandatory laptop requirement.
Okay, so would that then determine these standards? Already there are some.
No, one of the things we were talking about earlier is where does your school fall in the technology spectrum? How do you measure where you are compared to other?
That's what the questionnaire should help do.
Well, that's true, but how do you? If you see where you are, if you're on the low end of the spectrum, and whatever that determines, but what are standards going to do to help you get to the next level? And how many levels should there be? Because we've got people on one end that all they do is just provide basic desktop support, and that's it. And on the other end, we've got people that are doing webcasting, distance learning, and all that.
Well, I think the key is through the questionnaire argument is right now, except when we get together here and talk, I'm in school X. I don't know what schools A, B, C, and D are doing, except occasionally everybody looks it out. Whereas when you get the questionnaire process, the questionnaire results are published. You know what everybody else is doing. You can go to your dean or to your university president and say, well, you can no longer say you don't know. Now, you either, if you're going to decide you don't want to try to catch these other schools, that's an affirmative decision. The defense of ignorance isn't there anymore.
And through no fault of their own, or one way or the other, I know at least 2 schools that create their own technology boot camps just to get their students all on the same level. That was out of necessity because they were rolling out all this technology that wasn't being used, and they identified both the faculty and the students as sort of the weak links in the acquisition of the new technology. So it varies, and it's pretty wide in terms of that.
On the subject of the questionnaire aspect of this thing, and a way to think about it, I think, is by comparison with the library standards, is to think about a job interview at an unfamiliar school. If you're a librarian and you go to interview at a school and you have access to the ABA questionnaire, you know what they're doing and how they compare to all the other schools. You know where they rank and what they're spending on their cereals and how many tables they have in the library and any number of things. You go into an interview in someplace you've never been, and you've got the numbers. You know exactly where they are. And that might be a goal for I don't think there's as much shifting around at great distances with tech people, but if you think about it that way, it gives you an idea of what you'd like to see in that questionnaire.
What I'm hearing, because we're getting close on time, just a moment, is there's 2 action items that I'm hearing. One is Ken's going to try to get us a section at ALS. The second is we're going to try to work on these standards, but the mechanism for doing that is really the ABA questionnaire. That's where we need to start our immediate approach.
In that committee.
That's what I mean. This small committee.
Well, no, wasn't it? It's already.
Oh, the technology committee.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes.
No, I was just going to say that sort of what you just said. I think that it would be helpful to, rather than start with the generic standard, Nick said, try not to get too specific, develop the questions, because it seems like these technology questions are all over the place.
Yes.
So to be measuring, is there sufficient classroom technology? Is there sufficient desktop support? What's the status of the technology professionals that you have? Sort of develop the questions, and then
Right.
maybe they fit in as subsets within existing standards already. I don't know, just sort of.
That could be, and
So
because
it
we
goes
have,
back to Sally's chicken and egg.
because we've got such a short time frame before before the technology standard, the proposed technology standard may or may not take place, I think that we ought to work towards the next time that we have an opportunity to revise
Which would,
that.
I believe, be the 2006-2007 questionnaire would be the next time we would have a chance to influence what goes in the questionnaire.
The technology committee gets to get revved up, so however we can help you all who are on the committee.
Well, we'll make a call to the chairperson and see whether or not he wants to continue to be the chairperson. I think that's probably one way to do it.
And I suggest that one of the first missions, goals, or statements, or whatever, of any section we do form will be input on such a questionnaire.
Thank you all. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say, this is probably way overkill, but one of the things that could also be done is to set up through another organization like CALI or something like that, a set of standards completely independent of the ABA, that you can go to the ABA and say, you should point to these standards. That way, they don't have to define it.
Right.
They can simply accept somebody else's standards.
Right.
And then there would be like a separate certifying process.
Or they could extract out what they want, but at least they're.
Are they new standards, or are they standards?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Everyone have a safe.